Kale Rivers had attended exactly 47 diplomatic functions in his 18 months as Earth's cultural liaison, and he still couldn't remember which species considered direct eye contact a declaration of war or a marriage proposal. Either way, he'd learned to keep his gaze carefully focused on people's foreheads for the better part of an hour, which probably made him look either deeply respectful or mildly concussed. The grand ballroom of Meridian Crossing stretched before him like something from a fever dream, designed by a committee of ambitious architects who decided subtlety was for cowards. If you were going to host diplomatic gatherings for 17 different worlds, you might as well commit fully to the aesthetic. Bioluminescent panels lined the walls in undulating waves, shifting through colors based on the collective mood of the crowd. Currently, they swirled in diplomatic blue and cautious green, with occasional flashes of carefully suppressed irritation in shades of amber, colors Kale had learned to read like a mood ring for an entire civilization. The air itself hummed with overlapping translation fields, each one a subtle pressure against his eardrums as they converted a cacophony of alien languages into something his human brain could process without melting. The music was an algorithmic composition designed to be inoffensive to the maximum number of species, technically flawless, emotionally numbing, and somehow perfectly emblematic of diplomatic gatherings everywhere. Kale was navigating toward the refreshment tables, hoping that whatever passed for alcohol in this carefully neutral environment might dull his growing certainty that he'd chosen the wrong shade of gray when he saw her. She stood near one of the observation windows, where the station's curved hull created a panoramic view of stars stretching infinitely beyond. The woman was utterly still in a way that made everyone else in the ballroom seem frenetic by comparison. Her skin was pale enough to catch the ambient light, making her seem to glow faintly against the darkness of space. Black hair fell past her shoulders in waves that seemed to absorb rather than reflect photons, creating small pools of shadow that defied the ballroom's aggressive illumination. What caught Kale's attention wasn't just her striking appearance, though that was certainly notable, but her expression. She watched the dancers with a look he recognized immediately, the same one he saw in his own reflection at countless formal events. It was the expression of someone who wanted to join in, but had long since stopped expecting anyone to ask. Longing mixed with resignation. Hope that had learned to disguise itself as dignified solitude. Her ears were longer than human standard, tapering to elegant points that marked her as one of the species he probably should have memorized during his orientation, the orientation he definitely skipped in favor of lunch. The dark gown she wore seemed to move independently of any breeze, rippling like liquid shadow across her frame. Kale found his feet carrying him toward her before his brain had fully authorized the decision. He navigated between clusters of dignitaries who were undoubtedly discussing matters of interstellar importance with all the gravitas such conversations required, stepped past a Martian delegate explaining something with elaborate hand gestures to a group of officials who'd mastered the art of looking interested while thinking about something else entirely. When he reached her, she turned to look at him with eyes so dark they seemed to reflect no light at all. Up close, Kale noticed that the translation field around her shimmered differently than others, creating small distortions in the air that suggested her words needed extra processing. Or maybe it was just the station's environmental systems acting up again. Meridian Crossing was state-of-the-art, which in Kale's experience meant had state-of-the-art problems. He offered his most genuine smile, not the diplomatic one he'd learned to deploy like a shield, but the real one that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. "Would you like to dance?" For a moment, she simply stared at him. Kale's brain helpfully provided 17 different ways his simple question might have been catastrophically offensive. He was mentally composing an apology that would work for at least a dozen possibilities when her expression transformed. The change was remarkable. Her features softened, the careful distance melting away to reveal something that looked like surprised delight. She smiled, and it made her seem suddenly younger, less remote, more present. "Yes," she said, and her voice was warmer than he'd expected, like honey left in sunlight. "I would like that very much." When she placed her hand in his, Kale noticed it was cool, not unpleasantly so, like touching polished marble that had been kept in a climate-controlled environment, which technically they were currently in, so perhaps that made sense. They moved toward the dance floor, weaving between other couples. Kale noticed several conversations stop abruptly as they passed, faces turning to watch them with expressions he couldn't quite interpret. Several people actively backed away as they approached, creating a widening bubble of space around them. A woman from the Jupiter delegation actually retreated, as if approaching something dangerous. They found a spot among the dancers, and Cale positioned himself for a traditional waltz, one of exactly 3 dances he could perform without causing injury. The music shifted, the algorithm apparently detecting their intention and adjusting, and they began to move. I should probably mention that I'm not very good at this, Cale admitted as they found their rhythm. Fair warning, your feet are in moderate danger. She laughed, and the sound was surprisingly musical, like wind chimes made of crystal. Around them, other dancers adjusted their positions, creating more space. Cale assumed they were being considerate, given his self-proclaimed lack of coordination. I think I can manage the risk, she said. What's your name? Cale Rivers. Earth's cultural liaison, which is a fancy way of saying I attend parties and try not to accidentally start wars by using the wrong fork. Have you started any wars yet? Not intentionally. Though there was an incident with a Venusian diplomat and some cheese that's still under investigation. She smiled again, and Cale felt absurdly pleased that his terrible jokes were landing. They moved through the waltz with surprising ease. She was an extraordinary dancer, her movements precise and graceful in a way that suggested far more practice than any normal person should have. Every step was perfectly placed, every turn executed with mathematical precision. You're really good at this, Cale observed. Makes me look even worse by comparison, so thanks for that. I've had practice, she said, and something in her tone suggested considerably more than a few lessons at a community center. They danced through several more pieces, and Cale began to suspect his partner might actually be enjoying herself. The evidence was compelling. She hadn't excused herself to use the restroom and never returned. She was laughing at approximately 60% of his jokes, and she'd stopped looking like someone who expected disappointment at any moment. So, what brings you to Meridian Crossing? Cale asked as they transitioned into something that might have been a foxtrot. Let me guess. You're here to sign a treaty that will reshape the political landscape of the outer colonies. Something like that, she said, her eyes glinting with amusement. Though I find the actual politics considerably less interesting than the dancing. That's because politics is just theater for people who can't remember their lines, Cale said, narrowly avoiding stepping on her foot as another couple swept past. I mean, half of what we do here is just standing around pretending we understand what's happening while nodding seriously. She tilted her head, and her long ears caught the light in a way that was oddly mesmerizing. You don't find your work fulfilling. Oh, I didn't say that. I love my job. I just think there's something deeply absurd about the fact that I'm supposed to prevent interstellar incidents by remembering whether the Titan delegation prefers their beverages room temperature or precisely 17 degrees Celsius. That's a lot of pressure to put on one guy who barely passed his exams. How did you become a cultural liaison if you barely passed? Technically, I passed with flying colors. I just barely passed the psychological evaluation because apparently I have an irreverent attitude toward authority and a concerning tendency to make jokes during crisis simulations. Cale grinned. In my defense, if you can't laugh when a fake alien invasion scenario goes wrong, you're taking life too seriously. She laughed again, that crystalline sound that seemed to make the air vibrate differently. Cale noticed more people watching them now, their expressions ranging from curious to something that looked almost like fear. A group of officials from the outer worlds had clustered near a support column, whispering urgently while their eyes remained fixed on the dance floor. Does it bother you? His partner asked. Being watched. Are we being watched? I thought everyone was just admiring my impeccable dance technique. Cale executed what he believed was a turn with only minimal stumbling. Though now that you mention it, people have been acting weird. Maybe my reputation from the cheese incident has spread further than I thought. The cheese incident sounds fascinating. It really wasn't. Turns out Venusian diplomats have a cultural prohibition against dairy products made from earth animals, which no one mentioned to me before I offered the ambassador a sample of aged cheddar. He was very polite about his sudden need to evacuate the room, but I'm pretty sure I'm banned from their embassy. The music shifted into something with a Latin rhythm, and Cale felt a brief moment of panic before his partner smoothly adapted their movements. She was good enough to compensate for his limitations, making him look almost competent by association. You asked me to dance, she said as they moved through what might have been a tango. Why? Because you were standing over there looking like you wanted to, and no one else had asked. Seemed like a waste for someone who's clearly an amazing dancer to spend the whole evening watching from the sidelines. Something shifted in her expression, a softness that made her seem somehow more real and less like a particularly beautiful hologram. That's all. You didn't have any other reason. Should I have had another reason? Was I supposed to file a dance request form in triplicate? Because I definitely didn't do that, and now I'm worried I've committed some kind of protocol violation that's going to require an official apology. No forms required, she assured him. I'm simply not used to people approaching without extensive planning. Planning for dancing? That seems like it would take all the fun out of it. Dancing should be spontaneous. Otherwise, it's just choreographed movement with extra steps, which I guess is technically what dancing is, but you know what I mean. I do, she said quietly. More than you might think. They moved into a slower piece, something that allowed for actual conversation without Cale having to divide his attention between talking and not causing collision. His partner's hand rested lightly on his shoulder, and he was struck again by how cool her skin felt. So, what's your name? Cale asked, realizing with embarrassment that they'd been dancing for at least 20 minutes without him actually inquiring. I've been calling you my dance partner in my head, which works but seems impersonal. She hesitated for the briefest moment, and Cale saw something flicker across her face that might have been uncertainty. Salivra. Salivra. That's beautiful. Is it from your home world? In a manner of speaking, it's quite old. Old names are the best names. They have history. Unlike mine, which my parents picked because they thought it sounded futuristic and professional. They were very concerned about my future employability even before I was born. Did it work? Well, I'm employed, so technically yes. Though I'm not sure Cale is what clinched the job. I think it was more my ability to smile while people yell at me about cheese. The bubble of space that other dancers maintained around them had grown even larger. Cale was starting to wonder if perhaps he'd missed a memo about some kind of contamination scare. A Martian delegate actually backed into a refreshment table while trying to increase the distance between them, sending several glasses of something luminescent crashing to the floor. Your friends seem concerned, Salivra observed, nodding toward where David Chun was standing near the entrance, his face pale, and his eyes wide with what looked like genuine horror. David always looks like that at parties. I think he finds the whole diplomatic scene stressful. Cale waved at his colleague, who did not wave back, but instead appeared to be experiencing some kind of medical emergency based on his expression. Though that's a particularly intense version of his usual anxiety face. Perhaps you should check on him. He's fine. If it were a real emergency, he'd signal me with our code. Cale and David had developed a system for extracting each other from uncomfortable situations, though so far had mostly involved David rescuing Cale from conversations with people who wanted to discuss agricultural subsidies in extensive detail. The music swelled, and they moved through another turn. Cale was actually starting to feel confident in his dancing, which in his experience was usually right before something went catastrophically wrong. But Salivra was an excellent lead despite technically being in the follow position, and he found himself relaxing into the rhythm. I haven't enjoyed an evening this much in longer than I can remember, Salivra said, and there was something in her voice that sounded like genuine surprise. Thank you for asking me to dance, Cale Rivers. Thank you for saying yes, and for not mentioning how many times I've almost stepped on your feet. I stopped counting after 12. That's generous. I'm pretty sure it's been at least 15. She smiled, and Cale felt absurdly proud of himself for making this intimidatingly elegant woman laugh. Whatever else happened tonight, he'd managed to give someone a good time at a diplomatic function, which felt like a genuine accomplishment. David was definitely trying to get his attention now, making increasingly frantic gestures that Cale was determinedly ignoring. Whatever crisis his colleague thought was unfolding could wait until after this dance ended. The current dance ended with a flourish that Cale only partially botched, and Salivra suggested they take a break. He was grateful. His feet were beginning to protest the unaccustomed activity, and he could feel sweat forming despite the station's aggressive climate control. They made their way toward the refreshment tables, where an array of beverages in various colors and viscosities waited in temperature-controlled containers. So the trick with these, Cale explained, gesturing at the drinks, is that approximately half of them will get you intoxicated. A quarter of them are just flavored water, and the remaining quarter will cause mild gastrointestinal distress if you're not from the right planet. It's like Russian roulette, but with more diplomatic incidents. Which do you recommend? The blue one is safe. It's from Earth, specifically designed to be inoffensive to the maximum number of species. It tastes like someone tried to make fruit punch, but gave up halfway through and added disappointment. Salivra laughed and reached for one of the blue beverages. Her cool fingers brushed against his as she took the glass, and Cale noticed that several nearby delegates actually flinched at the contact. He was beginning to think perhaps he'd worn too much cologne, though he was fairly certain he hadn't worn any. Before he could comment on the strange behavior, David appeared at his elbow with the energy of a man who just watched someone juggle live grenades. His colleague's face had progressed beyond pale into a color that might generously be described as existential dread gray. "Kale," David said, his voice tight. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" "Sure, but make it quick. I'm in the middle of explaining the station's beverage selection." David's hand clamped around Kale's arm with surprising strength, and he found himself being physically pulled away from the refreshment table. Solivra watched this development with an expression of polite interest, sipping her disappointing blue beverage with perfect composure. "What's wrong with you?" Kale asked as David dragged him behind a decorative plant that was probably from somewhere with very different concepts of what plants should look like. "Forget the cheese," David hissed, his eyes wild. "What are you doing?" "I was having a drink and explaining the complex politics of interstellar refreshments. Before that, I was dancing with her." Kale gestured toward Solivra. "Yes, I was dancing with a lovely woman who was standing alone. Is that a problem? Did I miss some kind of sign-up sheet?" David stared at him with an expression that suggested Kale had just announced his intention to challenge a neutron star to a fist fight. "Do you have any idea who that is?" "Her name is Solivra. She's an excellent dancer. She appreciates my terrible jokes, and she seems to enjoy blue beverages that taste like disappointment. That's pretty much all I know, and honestly, it's been working out great so far." David's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "That's Queen Solivra. She's one of the oldest and most powerful sovereigns in known space. She's a vampire queen, Kale. A vampire queen." The words took a moment to process, bouncing around in Kale's brain like confused particles in a collider. He replayed the last hour in his mind. The cool touch of her hand, the way other people maintained careful distance, the extraordinary grace with which she moved, those dark eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Oh," Kale said, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. That's interesting information." "Interesting." David's whisper was becoming progressively less whisper-like. "You walked up to vampire royalty and asked her to dance like you were inviting your neighbor to a barbecue. People spend weeks negotiating the protocol for approaching her. Entire diplomatic teams plan their interactions months in advance. Dancing with a vampire queen carries enormous political implications. It's a statement about alliances and power dynamics." "And I thought she looked lonely," Kale interrupted, still trying to reconcile the friendly woman who'd laughed at his jokes with the concept of ancient vampire royalty. She was standing by the window watching people dance, and she looked like she wanted to join in. Of course she looked like that. She's Queen Solivra. Her touch is considered dangerous. Nobody approaches her casually. The fact that you're still standing here suggests she found your ignorance amusing rather than insulting, which is—" David paused, his face cycling through several more shades of panic. "Actually, I don't know if that's better or worse." Kale turned to look back at Solivra, who was still standing by the refreshment table. She'd been joined by two figures in dark formal who were speaking to her in low, urgent tones. Her expression remained pleasantly neutral, but there was something in the way she held herself that suddenly seemed different. Not the relaxed posture of someone enjoying a party, but the careful stillness of someone who could move with devastating speed if required. As if sensing his attention, she looked up and met his eyes across the distance. Her smile was knowing, edged with amusement, and Kale understood with sudden clarity that she knew exactly what David was telling him. She'd known from the moment he'd approached her what a massive breach of protocol his casual invitation represented, and she'd accepted it anyway. "She's laughing at me," Kale said, though there was no malice in the observation. "She thinks my horrified realization is funny." "Of course she's laughing at you. You probably gave her the most entertainment she's had in decades." David was gripping Kale's shoulders now, as if physical contact might somehow transfer understanding more effectively. "Do you know what happens when someone asks a vampire queen to dance? It's analyzed by political experts. Treaties have been written about less significant interactions. The delegation from New Saturn once spent 3 months preparing a formal request for an audience, and you just walked up and said, 'Would you like to dance?' Like you were asking for directions to the bathroom." In my defense, I genuinely didn't know. That's not a defense. That's the problem. David took a breath, clearly trying to compose himself. Okay. What's done is done. You've danced with vampire royalty multiple times in front of everyone. This is going to be analyzed and discussed and probably written about in diplomatic journals. The question now is what you do next. I was thinking I'd go back and continue our conversation about beverages, Kale said. We were having a nice time. You were having a nice time with a vampire queen who could probably kill you with one hand while filing paperwork with the other. She doesn't seem like the killing type. More the laughing at confused humans type. Kale. David gently removed his colleague's hands from his shoulders. I appreciate the concern and the extremely alarming information about vampire politics, but she accepted my invitation. She's been dancing with me for over an hour. She's been kind and funny and seems to be genuinely enjoying herself. So I'm going to go back over there and continue treating her like someone I asked to dance because apparently that's the only approach that's worked so far. That's insane. Probably, but insanity seems to be my specialty. Kale straightened his jacket and started walking back toward the refreshment table. If I don't come back, please make sure my apartment plants get watered. They're probably dead already, but it's the thought that counts. He could feel David's horrified stare boring into his back as he crossed the ballroom. Other guests parted before him like he was emitting some kind of repellent field, their expressions mixing fascination with concern. The two figures who'd been speaking with Solivra stepped back as he approached, their faces carefully neutral, but their body language screaming disapproval. Solivra watched him return with that same amused expression, her dark eyes glinting with something that might have been respect or might have been the vampire equivalent of deciding not to eat the entertaining pet. So, Kale said, picking up his own disappointing blue beverage. Apparently you're royalty, which explains why David looked like he was having a medical emergency. I feel like that's the sort of thing that might have come up during our conversation about my cheese-related diplomatic failures. Solivra's laugh was different this time, less controlled and more genuine, the sound rippling through the air like music played on instruments that didn't quite exist in normal space. You knew I was enjoying watching your face when the realization hit, she said. That was uncharitable of me. I've had worse things done to me in the name of entertainment, Kale replied, taking a sip of his beverage and immediately regretting it. Though I have to say, finding out I've been casually dancing with vampire royalty does rank pretty high on my list of situations I was completely unprepared for despite extensive training. Your training didn't cover accidentally dancing with ancient sovereigns. There was a module on it, but I was sick that day. Food poisoning from the cafeteria's attempt at pasta. Kale set down his drink with finality. So, should I be apologizing? David made it sound like I'd committed some kind of catastrophic breach of protocol that might result in diplomatic consequences and possibly my untimely death. Solivra's expression softened, and she reached out to touch his arm lightly. Even knowing what she was, the coolness of her hand still felt oddly comfortable. Do you want to know something? She said. When you walked up to me and asked if I'd like to dance, do you know what I thought? That you didn't know who I am. She withdrew her hand but held his gaze. Do you understand how rare that is? Everyone who approaches me knows exactly who I am. Every word they speak is calculated. Every gesture is weighted with implications about alliances or demonstrations of courage or requests for favor. When someone asks me to dance, it's never simple. It's a political statement that will be analyzed by experts and discussed in council chambers. That sounds exhausting. It is. But you asked me to dance because I looked like I wanted to. No calculation, no agenda, no attempt to prove your bravery or secure advantage. For an hour, I got to be simply someone who enjoyed dancing with someone who thought I might want to dance. She smiled, and there was something almost vulnerable in it. That's more precious than you can possibly understand. Kale felt his embarrassment fading, replaced by something warmer. Well, when you put it that way, I feel less like an idiot and more like I accidentally did something right for completely wrong reasons. That's how the best things often happen. That's either very profound or you're making fun of me again. I honestly can't tell. One of the figures in dark formal wear, a vampire courtier, Kale now realized, stepped forward with an expression of barely contained disapproval. He was tall and severe, with a kind of face that suggested he'd never found anything amusing in several centuries of existence. Your Majesty, the courtier said, his tone dripping with formality that somehow also conveyed criticism. Perhaps we should return to the designated area. This interaction has generated considerable attention. Lord Thuron, Solivra replied, her voice remaining pleasant but containing something that made the courtier take an involuntary step backward. Are you suggesting I should stop enjoying myself at a diplomatic celebration designed specifically for enjoyment? Not at all, Your Majesty. Simply that protocol dictates. Protocol dictates that I maintain appropriate dignity as a sovereign of the Sanguine territories. It does not, to my recollection, dictate whom I may or may not dance with." She turned back to Kale. "Unless you've had enough of dancing with someone who apparently comes with complicated political implications." "I mean, I was planning to spend this evening standing near walls and looking professionally concerned," Kale said. "But dancing with vampire royalty while various officials have small panic attacks sounds more interesting. So if you're willing to risk further damage to protocol, I'm in." Salivra's smile was brilliant. "I believe one more dance wouldn't hurt." Lord Thuron made a sound that might have been a sigh, or possibly the vampire equivalent of suppressed rage, but he stepped aside. The other courtier, a woman with silver hair, and an expression slightly less severe than Thuron's, actually smiled faintly before following her colleague back to whatever constituted the vampire delegation's official position in the ballroom. As they moved back toward the dance floor, Kale noticed the crowd's reaction had evolved from shock into something more complex. Some faces showed disapproval, others showed fascination, and a few, mostly younger delegates from various worlds, showed something that looked almost like approval. A human official he vaguely recognized was frantically speaking into a communications device, probably trying to figure out if this development required immediate intervention from someone more important. The music shifted into something slower, more intimate, and Kale found himself once again dancing with a woman he now knew could probably break him in half without much effort, but who instead was choosing to laugh at his jokes and pretend he wasn't completely out of his depth. "So what happens after this?" Kale asked. "Do I need to fill out forms, make official statements, sign something promising not to accidentally dance with any more vampire queens?" "After this, I will make it clear to my people and to the other delegations that your invitation was not presumption. It was recognition that even queens who rule territories and command respect across known space might occasionally want to dance without the weight of centuries pressing down on every step." That's a much nicer way of saying he had no idea what he was doing, but worked out. Sometimes the best diplomacy comes from people who don't realize they're being diplomatic. They moved through the dance, and Kale was aware of David watching from the sidelines with an expression that suggested he was still calculating the potential fallout from this evening. Other officials were positioning themselves strategically, probably preparing to either take credit for or distance themselves from whatever this represented in the complex algebra of interstellar relations. "I should probably tell you," Salivra said as they completed another turn, "that by accepting your invitation and dancing with you multiple times, I've essentially made a statement about Earth's diplomatic standing in relation to the Sanguine territories. Various officials will spend the next several weeks trying to determine exactly what that statement means. Is it a good statement, or we're going to have problems statement? It's a vampire queen appreciates genuine kindness over calculated politics statement, which I think is the best kind." The music began to wind down, and Kale realized this would probably be their last dance. The evening was drawing to a close, guests beginning to make their departures with all the elaborate farewell rituals that diplomatic functions required. Soon they'd return to their respective ships and stations, carrying stories about the human cultural liaison who danced with vampire royalty without knowing it. "Thank you," Salivra said as the final notes played, "for giving me an evening of being asked as a woman rather than as a queen. For proving that sometimes not knowing who you're dancing with allows you to see them more clearly than any amount of protocol ever could. Thank you for not immediately having me thrown out an airlock when you realized I had no idea what I was doing," Kale replied, "and for making me look like a much better dancer than I actually am." She laughed one more time, that crystalline sound that made the air vibrate with frequencies just outside normal hearing. Then she leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to something only he could hear. "Next time there's a diplomatic gathering, perhaps you'll ask me to dance again now that you know who I am. Will it cause massive political complications?" "Almost certainly." "Then I'll definitely ask." Salivra stepped back, and just like that she was Queen Salivra again, the ancient sovereign whose presence commanded careful distance and whose every action carried weight. Her courtiers materialized at her sides, and she inclined her head to Kale with formal grace before turning to make her farewells to the other dignitaries. David appeared at Kale's elbow, his color slowly returning to something approaching normal. "I can't believe you survived that." "I can't believe I spent an hour dancing with vampire royalty and didn't realize it until you told me," Kale said, watching as Salivra moved through the crowd toward the exit. Though in retrospect the extremely long ears and the way people kept backing away should have been clues. "What are you going to put in your report?" The truth. That I asked someone to dance because she looked like she wanted to, and it turned out to be the most honest diplomatic interaction of my entire career. Kale grinned at his colleague's expression. Also, I'm definitely going to need you to explain vampire protocol to me before the next gathering. Just in case. Just in case I decide to accidentally revolutionize interstellar diplomacy again. Something like that, David muttered, shaking his head as if he still couldn't quite believe what he'd witnessed. As Kale watched Salivra disappear into the crowd, he realized that sometimes the best moments in life came from the simple act of seeing someone, truly seeing them, and offering them exactly what they needed. Not because protocol demanded it, not because politics required it, but simply because they looked like they wanted it. In a universe governed by complex rules and careful calculations, he'd stumbled upon something far more valuable than any diplomatic victory. He discovered that genuine human kindness, offered without agenda or forethought, could transcend species and centuries alike, creating a moment of connection that no amount of formal negotiation could ever achieve.